At 1:47 p.m. on September 18, 1944, the arithmetic of war was entirely against Private Thomas Bartlett. He was crouched inside a hollowed-out hay bale near Eindhoven, in the Netherlands, effectively invisible to the world outside. Approaching his position was a column of 34 German soldiers marching directly toward him. The military manuals of 1944 were clear on what an infantryman should do when encountering the enemy: engage, suppress, flank. But the manuals were written by men sitting in offices in Washington, not men crouching in the Dutch mud. Bartlett had no radio, he had no backup, and perhaps most critically, his M1 Garand rifle held exactly 8 rounds. Do the math. 8 rounds for 34 targets. Even with perfect marksmanship, assuming 1 bullet per man, Bartlett would run dry with 26 enemy soldiers still standing, angry, and very much armed. In the standard doctrine of infantry combat, this wasn't a tactical problem. It was a suicide pact. If he fired a single shot, he would be dead within minutes. But Bartlett didn't see the battlefield the way the drill sergeants at Fort Benning had taught him to see it. He didn't see a target-rich environment or a moment for glorious sacrifice. He saw a geometry problem. The German column was moving with what historians might call exhausted confidence. Their boots scraped against the cobblestone. Their voices drifted through the air, complaining about rations and the American advance. They had no idea that the agricultural debris 30 meters ahead of them wasn't just a pile of dried wheat. It was a trap. Bartlett's breathing slowed as he watched through a small gap he had carved into the compressed stalks. He watched the lead sergeant light a cigarette with a trembling hand. He noted the fatigue, the sloppy formation, the assumption of safety. In the next 40 minutes, Private Bartlett would dismantle that entire platoon. He would capture all 34 men without firing a single lethal shot. He wouldn't do it with superior firepower, and he wouldn't do it with Hollywood bravery. He would do it using a deception so simple it had been sitting right in front of military tacticians for 3 years. He would do it because, while the Army taught him how to die, the wheat fields of Iowa had taught him how to survive. To understand how one man could dismantle a German platoon with nothing but agricultural waste and a bedsheet, you have to understand where Tommy Bartlett came from. He wasn't bred in a military academy. He wasn't a product of West Point strategy sessions. He was a product of 340 acres of wheat and corn outside Cedar Rapids, Iowa. In the 1930s and 40s, the Bartlett farm wasn't a business. It was an exercise in survival. It was a place where the margin between getting by and going under was measured in inches of rain and bushels of yield. Tommy was not the football captain. He wasn't the class president. He wasn't athletic, and he certainly wasn't popular. He was the quiet kid in the back of the class who watched. His education began long before the Army drafted him in January 1943. By the age of 9, he was driving a tractor. By 12, he was repairing the complex internal gearing of a combine harvester. But his most important lessons came from the hay barn. His father paid him exactly $1 a week to stack hay bales. These weren't the small, manageable bundles you see at a petting zoo. These were 500-pound rectangular blocks of compressed survival. For a teenage boy, moving them was physically impossible if you relied on muscle alone. You couldn't fight the hay. You had to understand it. Tommy learned leverage. He learned that brute force rarely beat smart positioning. He learned patience, that if you moved too fast, the stack would collapse. But if you placed the cornerstone correctly, the structure would hold against gravity and time. This work rewired his brain. While other boys saw a field, Tommy saw a schematic. He noticed which parts of the pasture flooded first when the spring rains came. He noticed which fence posts were rotting from the inside out before the wood even discolored. He noticed which cows would bolt during a thunderstorm, and, more importantly, which ones would stand perfectly still. His high school agriculture teacher noticed this unique quality, writing in a recommendation letter that Thomas sees systems where others see chaos. This was a profound observation for a farm kid, but it would become a life-saving talent in the chaos of Europe. When the Army sent him to basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, the culture shock was immediate. The drill sergeants screamed about aggression, speed, and violence of action. They wanted soldiers who reacted instantly, loud and fast. Bartlett, true to his nature, stayed quiet, but he was watching. He applied his farm logic to the recruits around him. He noticed that the men who sprinted fastest through the obstacle courses were often the ones who failed the navigation exercises because they were moving too quickly to think. He noticed that the loudest soldiers in the barracks, the ones who bragged about what they would do to the Germans, were usually the first to freeze when the simulated machine gun fire started. He realized the army was training men to be spooked cattle. A spooked cow stampedes. It runs blind, fueled by adrenaline and fear. That was the army way. Charge the hill, storm the beach, overwhelm the enemy. But Bartlett knew something else about livestock. He knew about the tired cow. Bartlett had spent 18 years reading animals. He knew that when a cow is exhausted, hungry, and disoriented, it stops thinking for itself. It looks for the tail of the cow in front of it and follows. A tired cow will follow the leader straight into the barn, even if the barn is on fire. This was the revelation that would save his life in Holland. Men weren't different from cattle. Strip away the uniforms, the ideology, and the rifles, and you are left with a biological organism that responds to exhaustion in predictable ways. Bartlett understood that a terrified enemy fights back, but an exhausted enemy seeks a path of least resistance. The drill sergeants taught him how to kill, but the wheat fields of Iowa taught him how to herd. And as he would discover in the fall of 1944, sometimes herding the enemy is far more effective than fighting them. By the time he landed in Normandy, a paperwork error had transferred him to the 101st Airborne. Surrounded by elite paratroopers who had trained for months, Bartlett had trained for weeks. But he carried a weapon his comrades didn't have, the ability to see the battlefield not as a series of targets, but as a system of behaviors waiting to be manipulated. He was about to prove that a farmer's patience was deadlier than a soldier's aggression. By the time Bartlett reached the Netherlands in September 1944, he carried a heavy, invisible burden, the memory of 18 men. These were 18 names, 18 faces, and 18 sets of hometowns and girlfriends' names that he knew by heart. But what haunted Bartlett wasn't just that they died, it was how they died. In France, Bartlett had observed a terrifying pattern. Good men were being slaughtered not because they lacked courage, but because they followed the rules. They followed a doctrine that treated every combat situation as an identical problem to be solved with an identical solution. He watched Private First Class Danny McKinnon, a dairy farmer from Wisconsin, who planned to expand his herd after the war. McKinnon followed the manual on crossing hedgerows. A German sniper, knowing exactly where the manual said a soldier would emerge, put a bullet through his throat from 400 meters away. McKinnon drowned in his own blood in 47 seconds, while Bartlett held his hand. He watched Corporal James Chen step on a buried Teller mine in an orchard. The explosion took both his legs. Chen screamed for his mother for 6 minutes until the morphine finally took hold. He watched his squad leader, Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan, a decorated, careful man from Boston, attempt to flank a German MG-42 machine gun position. Donovan executed the flanking maneuver exactly as the infantry school taught, but the German gunner had read the same tactics. He anticipated the move and cut Donovan down with 11 rounds across the chest. The lesson was brutal and clear. The manual was written by officers in safe rooms who had never bled in the dirt. Predictability was death. To survive, Bartlett realized he had to start breaking the small rules. He began crossing hedgerows at wrong angles. He waited 30 seconds longer than ordered before advancing. His lieutenant noticed the insubordination, but stayed silent because Bartlett's squad simply stopped dying. Then came Operation Market Garden. The plan was sold as a masterstroke. Paratroopers would capture key bridges, armor would race north, and the war would be over by Christmas. But reality was far messier. German resistance was ferocious, supply lines snapped, and communication broke down. By September 17th, Bartlett's platoon was securing a crossroads near Eindhoven. The intelligence reports claimed the sector was clear. It wasn't. The area was teeming with German stragglers, units cut off from their main force, wandering through farmland, desperate to reconnect with their lines. This created a unique tactical problem. These Germans weren't dug in. They were moving. They were dangerous, but they were also lost. Bartlett's commanding officer, Lieutenant Marcus Hayes, was an anomaly. A 23-year-old former history teacher, Hayes didn't care about body counts. He wanted everyone to go home. He gathered the platoon and gave an order that few officers would give. If you can capture instead of kill, do it. But don't take unnecessary risks. The regiment wanted prisoners for interrogation. This was the friction point. The safe way to deal with a German column was to ambush them with overwhelming firepower, to kill them. To capture them required getting close. It required exposing yourself. To capture 34 armed men when you are alone requires something else entirely. It requires you to throw the rule book into the mud and write your own. Bartlett looked at the abandoned farm they were holding. He smelled the old wheat and the rain. He saw the scattered hay bales, and he realized that while the Army manual had no section for this situation, his father's farm did. That evening the war paused for a moment of quiet. Bartlett stood watch near the perimeter of an abandoned farm, joined by Private Eddie Sullivan from Brooklyn. Sullivan was 19, loud, and used humor to mask the constant terror of the front lines. Sullivan looked at the ruined barn and saw wreckage. He saw a roof missing, shrapnel-torn wood, and the debris of a conflict that had swept through weeks earlier. Bartlett saw something else. He was studying the hay bales scattered around the property, rectangular blocks, roughly 80 pounds each. Sullivan noticed Bartlett's 1,000-yard stare and quipped, "You got that look, the look my uncle gets when he's about to fix something nobody knew was broken." Bartlett didn't respond. The gears of the combine harvester in his mind were meshing. He wasn't looking at animal feed. He was looking at advanced camouflage. At 11:30 p.m., he walked to Lieutenant Hayes with a proposition that would have sounded insane to any other officer. "Sir, I need permission to try something," Bartlett said. He explained that he had tracked German movement to the northeast, patrols of 30 to 40 men moving in column formation, acting as if they were behind their own lines. He believed he could capture them. "Your entire squad?" Hayes asked. "Just me, sir," Bartlett replied. Bartlett laid out the logic. The Germans were exhausted. They were sticking to roads, a fatal mistake, and assuming the sector was secure. He proposed using their own, assumptions against them. He needed two things, the right positioning and the right props. The props? Hay bales and a white flag. Hayes stared at him for a long 15 seconds. Finally, he delivered his verdict. "If you get killed doing this, I'm writing a very unflattering letter to your mother. If it works, I'm writing you up for a commendation you'll probably never receive because it's the dumbest smart idea I've ever heard. You have until dawn." At midnight, the engineering began. Bartlett worked alone in the dark of the abandoned barn. He selected a bale that was slightly weathered, with binding twine loose enough to manipulate without snapping. This was precision work. Using his Ka bar knife, he began to carve out the bale's interior. It was grueling, tactile labor. The hay dust filled his nose and throat, and despite the September chill, sweat soaked his uniform. He had to remove enough compressed wheat to create a cavity roughly 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide, just enough space to crouch inside with a rifle. But the real trick wasn't the hole, it was the debris. Every handful of straw he pulled out had to be hidden. If he left a pile of fresh hay on the ground, it would be a dead giveaway. He meticulously stuffed the loose hay into other damaged bales to hide the evidence. By 1:15 a.m., the prototype was ready. He tested it, crouching inside. With the opening facing away from the road, he was invisible. The smell of the wheat hit him, a scent of Iowa autumns and his father's barn. For a brief, dangerous moment, homesickness washed over him, almost urging him to abandon the plan. But then the memories of McKinnon bleeding out and Chen screaming for his mother forced his focus back to the mission. Next came the stagecraft. Bartlett hauled his hollowed bale to a spot 30 meters from the dirt road the Germans were using. The geometry was critical. If he placed it too close, a curious soldier might sit on it or kick it. If he placed it too far, his voice wouldn't carry, and the psychological trick wouldn't work. He arranged 3 other intact bales around his hollowed one, creating a natural-looking cluster of farm debris. To the passing eye, it was just random clutter scattered by the wind. Then the final prop. He took a white bedsheet from the barn, tore it into a 3/4-foot rectangle, and tied it to a sharpened stick, a white flag, the universal symbol of surrender. But in Bartlett's hands, it was a weapon of disorientation. At 4:30 a.m., he climbed into the bale. He brought his M1 Garand with 8 rounds, 4 grenades he hoped never to use, and his white flag. The space was cramped. The hay pressed against his shoulders. His legs cramped almost immediately. Through a tiny gap he'd carved in the stalks, he had a 60-degree view of the road. He sat in the dark, muscles seizing, waiting for the sun to rise. He knew that tired men made mistakes at dawn. He was betting his life that 34 German soldiers would see what they expected to see, a pile of hay, rather than the trap that was waiting to spring. The trap was set. Now he just needed the prey. At 6:15 a.m., the birds began to sing near Eindhoven. The sky shifted from an impenetrable black to a bruised gray, signaling the start of the most dangerous phase of Thomas Bartlett's plan. Inside the hay bale, the romance of the idea had long vanished, replaced by the agonizing physical reality. Bartlett's legs were numb below the knees. His back was locked in a cramp that screamed for movement. But movement meant detection, and detection meant death. He remained a statue, a ghost in the machine of agriculture, waiting for his audience to arrive. At 7:30 a.m., the sound of boots on dirt broke the morning silence. It wasn't a stealthy approach. It was the heavy, dragging cadence of defeated men. Bartlett heard German voices arguing through the fog, complaints about rations, debates about the distance to the rally point. His heart rate, conditioned by years of hunting and patience, actually slowed. The column materialized out of the mist. 34 soldiers in a loose, sloppy formation. They carried their rifles slung over their shoulders, the universal posture of men who believe the fight is elsewhere. The lead sergeant was smoking a cigarette. 3 men in the rear were sharing a canteen. They marched past Bartlett's position at a distance of only 20 meters. Not a single soldier looked at the cluster of hay bales. To them, it was just scenery. Bartlett waited. He let the last soldier pass. Then, demonstrating a restraint that defied every instinct of self-preservation, he counted to 30. Only then did he push himself out of the hollowed wheat. His legs nearly collapsed as the blood rushed back into his calves, forcing him to grab a stone wall for support. He stuck the white flag into his belt, gripped his M1 Garand, and began to hunt. The Germans had failed to post a rear guard, a fatal, amateurish mistake born of exhaustion. Bartlett trailed them at 50 meters, using the heavy morning fog as his cloak. The visibility was barely 100 meters, turning the Dutch countryside into a gray room where sound traveled further than sight. At 8:10 a.m., the column reached a crossroads where 3 farm paths intersected. They stopped. The sergeant pulled out a map. Packs dropped to the ground. Cigarettes were lit. One soldier wandered off to urinate in a ditch. They were comfortable, and that was Bartlett's signal. He circled to their front, moving silently through the damp grass to a position behind an overturned farm cart, 30 meters ahead of the lead German. He checked his rifle. He took the white flag in his left hand, and then he initiated the play. Bartlett stood up. The Germans saw him immediately. Rifles snapped up, panic flashing through the group. Before they could pull a trigger, Bartlett raised the white flag high and shouted in his best broken German, a phrase he had learned from a prisoner weeks earlier. Americal Zintum Zingled. Americans everywhere. You are surrounded. He pointed confidently behind them, then gestured broadly to both their flanks. The Germans spun around, scanning the fog. They saw nothing because nothing was there. But exhausted men do not see with their eyes. They see with their fears. They saw threats in the shadows. The sergeant shouted commands, and the soldiers formed a defensive circle facing outward, aiming at the empty mist. Bartlett ramped up the pressure. He shouted again, 100 Amerikaner! No escape! Then he committed a court-martial offense. Infantry doctrine strictly forbids firing unless you have a target. Bartlett fired a single shot straight into the air. The crack of the rifle was the opening note of his symphony. Immediately after firing, he dove behind the cart and sprinted 30 meters to his left, sliding behind a stone wall. From this new position, he raised the flag again and shouted in a deeper register, Ehren wären Zivafen! Surrender! Throw down weapons! The Germans spun toward the new voice, disoriented. Some fired wild shots into the fog, aiming at the phantom soldier who had just yelled at them. Bartlett was already moving again. He circled to their right flank, reaching a cluster of hay bale. From this third position, he screamed, Kinnedite! American, come! No time! He fired a second shot into the air. To the German sergeant, the math was terrifyingly simple. He had heard voices from the front, the left, and the right. He had heard gunfire from multiple positions. The echoes in the fog made it sound like a dozen men were closing the net. The Germans were trapped in an auditory hall of mirrors. The sergeant shouted to hold position, but the psychological dam was breaking. Bartlett watched the reaction he had predicted back in Iowa. One spooked animal triggers panic, but one submissive animal triggers submission. Two young German soldiers, their nerves shredded by the invisible army surrounding them, dropped their rifles and raised their hands. That was the tipping point. Once two surrendered, the social proof took over. 3 more dropped their weapons, then 5, then 10. The sergeant tried to rally them, but he was outnumbered by his own men's collapse. His voice cracked. He looked into the fog and saw only death. Bartlett sensed the moment was ripe. He circled back to a position where the entire group could see him. He stood tall, holding the white flag high and his rifle low, non-threatening but ready. He delivered his final line. "War is over for you. No shame." The sergeant looked at his platoon. Half were disarmed. The rest were trembling. He lowered his MP-40 voice. "Where are Germans?" he asked. A confused inquiry, likely meaning, "Where are the men?" or "Where is the rest of your unit?" "We surrender," he said. The fog of war is usually a metaphor for confusion. For Thomas Bartlett, it was a canvas. He had painted a picture of a superior American force using nothing but acoustics, cardio, and the terrified imagination of his enemy. At 8:47 a.m., he marched 34 prisoners into the American perimeter. He was alone. When Lieutenant Hayes saw the column approaching, he stood frozen for 3 seconds. "Private Bartlett," he said slowly. "What the hell?" "Prisoners, sir, as requested," Bartlett replied. Later, during interrogation, the German sergeant, the one who had been smoking, was asked how many Americans had ambushed him. 30, maybe 40, the sergeant insisted. In the fog, difficult to count. They had us surrounded from 3 sides. Bartlett had not just captured their bodies. He had successfully hacked their reality. He had proven that in the geometry of survival, one man moving fast enough can equal 40 men standing still. By noon, the story of the hay bale ambush had ripped through the battalion. To the rank-and-file soldiers, it was hilarious. A farm kid from Iowa had weaponized theater to humiliate the master race. But to the officers, it was a problem. Captain Richard Morrison, Easy Company's commanding officer, summoned Bartlett to headquarters. The conversation that followed perfectly encapsulates the military's paradoxical relationship with innovation. Morrison didn't congratulate Bartlett. He dressed him down. "Private, your stunt could have triggered a massacre," Morrison said. "You had no backup, no communication, no extraction plan." Technically, the captain was right. Bartlett had violated approximately 7 tactical protocols. In the eyes of the institution, he was a liability. But then Morrison paused, forced to acknowledge the undeniable math sitting in the holding pen outside. 34 prisoners without a shot fired saves ammunition and prevents casualties, he admitted. "I'm not punishing you, but I'm not promoting you either. Clear? This is the unflattering letter in spirit, if not in ink. The Army is a machine designed for standardization. It craves predictability. Bartlett's success was messy because it was unrepeatable. That evening, Lieutenant Hayes sat with Bartlett and explained why this wouldn't become standard doctrine. It was too dependent on specific conditions, Hayes noted. Fog, exhausted enemy, your ability to speak German, your knowledge of psychology. Can't train that. Hayes, the former history teacher, offered a cynical but accurate critique of the profession. "We charge across fields because manuals written in 1917 say to charge across fields. Men die because we follow doctrine instead of thinking." But while the official channels buried the story, the underground network, the whispers between sergeants and privates, kept it alive. 3 days later, Sergeant Robert Chen, no relation to the deceased James Chen, used a similar principle of voice deception and psychological pressure to capture 19 Germans without a fight. By October, at least 6 separate incidents occurred where American patrols used weaponized paranoia instead of bullets. The Germans noticed. Intelligence reports from late 1944 show that German commanders became terrified of American psychological tactics, leading them to move slower and more cautiously, which ironically made them easier to target. The results were statistically significant. In September, the regiment averaged 4.2 American casualties for every prisoner captured. By November, after the Whisper network spread Bartlett's method, that ratio dropped to 1.8. Yet, the institution refused to see it. An Army intelligence report credited the improved safety record to superior training in non-lethal combat techniques, a training program that didn't exist. They credited the system, not the outlier. The final insult came 3 weeks later. Lieutenant Hayes submitted Bartlett for a Bronze Star, citing his extraordinary initiative. Battalion headquarters rejected it. The official reason was insufficient documentation of combat action. Hayes was furious, but he understood the subtext. The Army rewards bravery within the rules. It does not reward competence that ignores them. As Hayes told Bartlett, "You saved lives and they won't acknowledge it because you didn't follow their rules." Bartlett, true to form, didn't care about the ribbon. "Did it work?" he asked. "Yes," Hayes replied. "Then that's enough, sir." Tommy. Bartlett survived the war. He fought through the Battle of the Bulge, took shrapnel in the shoulder near Bastogne, and a bullet grazed across the ribs in Germany. By the time he went home in June 1945, he had killed at least 14 enemy soldiers, captured 47 more, and saved 3 Americans with basic first aid. He received no medals for any of it. When he stepped off the train in Cedar Rapids, his father shook his hand and said, "Good to have you back." Bartlett replied, "Good to be back." That was the entire conversation about the war. He went back to the barn, picked up a hay hook, and went to work. Bartlett lived an aggressively ordinary life. He married a nurse named Patricia, raised 3 children, and expanded the family farm to 5 to 20 acres. He never told war stories. When his son asked once, Bartlett simply said, "I did my job, came home." The only crack in his silence appeared once a year. Every September 18th, he received a phone call from Eddie Sullivan in Brooklyn. They talked about baseball and crops, never mentioning the war directly, but the call itself said everything. "We survived. We remember." Bartlett died in 1987. His obituary devoted 3 paragraphs to his corn yields and community service, and only 1 sentence to his service in the 101st Airborne. It wasn't until 2007, when a military historian named Dr. Sarah Kendrick dug up Lieutenant Hayes's rejected recommendation letter, that the hay bale ambush was properly documented. Today, Special Forces programs teach modified versions of his technique, sanitized under the name Environmental Psychology Application. Somewhere in Iowa, there is a barn filled with hay bales that look identical to the ones Tommy Bartlett hollowed out in 1944. They represent the difference between following rules and solving problems, between dying honorably and living cleverly. 34 German soldiers surrendered to a single private, not because he was the bravest man in the field, but because he was the smartest. In a war of dead heroes, Tommy Bartlett won the only victory that truly matters. He got to grow old.